The year was 1967, a world divided not just by borders, but by belief. From Washington to Moscow, from Tel Aviv to Cairo, the globe pulsed with the tension of an invisible war. A war not fought with tanks on open fields but with whispers, shadows, and secrets buried beneath official lies. The Cold War had reached its boiling point. In Southeast Asia, the jungles of Vietnam burned. In the Middle East, armies were massing on borders. And in laboratories hidden deep within both the Soviet Union and the United States, scientists worked tirelessly to build weapons that could erase entire nations in minutes. But beyond these headlines, something else was happening, something most history books never mention. A secret network of agents, double spies, and intelligence officers was moving quietly across continents, shaping the wars before they ever began. This was the silent front of 1967. In Moscow, a coded telegram arrived at dawn. The KGB had intercepted radio chatter from the Mediterranean, something unusual, something big. Reports suggested Israeli forces were preparing a sudden strike, but no one could confirm when or where. In the Kremlin's underground war room, generals debated, was it a bluff, or the beginning of another Western-backed offensive? Meanwhile, across the ocean in Langley, Virginia, CIA analysts were staring at the same data but from the other side. Satellites had picked up unusual movements in the Sinai desert. The Americans suspected that Egypt and Syria, backed by Soviet advisors, were preparing for something equally dangerous. No one knew who would strike first. And both sides, east and west, braced for impact. The world didn't know it yet, but the countdown to the Six-Day War had already begun. And behind every move, behind every official decision, intelligence agencies played a hidden chess game, moving pieces that could change history. In Cairo, President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before his generals. Pride and defiance burned in his eyes. He had expelled UN peacekeepers and closed the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's vital trade route. For him, it was a show of strength. But for the Israelis, it was an act of war. Far from the cameras, deep within Israeli intelligence, the Mossad had already begun an operation codenamed Focus. The plan: destroy the Egyptian Air Force before a single plane could leave the ground. It was bold, risky, and utterly secret. Even Israel's closest allies didn't know the details. On the morning of June 5, 1967, before sunrise, hundreds of Israeli jets roared into the sky. They flew low, under enemy radar. In less than 3 hours, nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. In one of the most devastating preemptive strikes in history, Israel had seized total control of the skies. But what followed wasn't just a war of nations, it was a war of narratives. Each side claimed victory, righteousness, and divine purpose. And in the background, the superpowers, the USA and USSR, began to pull the strings tighter. The Middle East had become their new battlefield. In Washington, advisors to President Lyndon B. Johnson debated whether to intervene. Publicly, America stayed neutral. Privately, intelligence reports and satellite photos were being funneled to Israeli command. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union armed Egypt and Syria with new tanks, MiG fighters, and surface-to-air missiles. Each shipment came with more than weapons, it came with Soviet advisors and hidden objectives. The conflict of 1967 wasn't just about borders or ideology. It was about control of oil, of trade routes, of global influence. And for both superpowers, the Middle East was a chessboard they could not afford to lose. As battles raged in Sinai, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, another war unfolded in silence. Encrypted messages zipped across radio channels. Agents vanished. Diplomats exchanged smiles by day and secrets by night. And in dark rooms, intelligence chiefs in both Moscow and Washington asked the same chilling question. If this war spreads, what happens when the nukes come out? No one had the answer. And that uncertainty was more dangerous than any weapon. The Six-Day War would end quickly, but the shadows it cast would linger for decades. For in those 6 days, alliances shifted, intelligence agencies expanded, and the seeds of countless future conflicts were planted. Some historians call it a miracle of strategy. Others call it a manipulation of fate. But those who were there in the bunkers, in the deserts, in the halls of power knew the truth. The real war of 1967 wasn't fought in daylight. It was fought in the dark, between men who believed they could control history and those who tried to survive it. And that's only the beginning. When the guns fell silent after 6 days of fire, the world gasped. Israel had won a lightning war, one that redrew maps, humiliated armies, and left superpowers scrambling to understand what had just happened. But while the world watched the flags change, something far more dangerous was beginning: the shadow war after the war. In Moscow, the Kremlin's reaction was immediate disbelief, then anger. The Soviet Union had backed Egypt and Syria with weapons, intelligence, and advisors. And now, in less than a week, those same armies had been crushed. To the Soviets, it wasn't just a defeat of their allies, it was a direct blow to their credibility. Meetings ran through the night inside the Ministry of Defense. Soviet generals demanded answers. How could American-backed forces pull off such precision strikes? The KGB suspected something deeper: a leak, or worse, a mole within their own ranks. A manhunt began quietly, targeting diplomats, translators, and military attachés stationed in Cairo and Damascus. Every whisper was recorded. Every message decoded. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about restoring fear. Meanwhile, in Washington, there was celebration but also unease. President Lyndon B. Johnson had publicly maintained that America had not interfered. Privately, intelligence officers from the CIA and NSA were compiling a secret report titled Project Silent Wing. It detailed how American reconnaissance planes, disguised as civilian aircraft, had monitored Egyptian radar frequencies in the weeks before the war. Officially, no one would ever admit it, but the report proved that the U.S. had quietly guided Israel's hand. And now, Washington had a new problem. The Soviet Union was preparing its response. By late July 1967, Soviet cargo ships began docking in Alexandria and Latakia. On board, new generations of MiG fighters, T-62 tanks, and surface-to-air missile systems, weapons never before exported. Thousands of technicians arrived too, though everyone knew they were soldiers in plain clothes. The Cold War had moved to the desert. In the meantime, the CIA and Mossad grew closer than ever. They exchanged coded transmissions and joint intelligence reports under codenames like Cedar Path and Desert Mirror. For the first time, Israel's agents were sharing decrypted Soviet communications directly with Langley, an alliance that would change the balance of espionage in the Middle East forever. But beneath the strategy and politics, the human cost of 1967 began to show. In Cairo, Egyptian hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers. Families searched for sons who would never return. In Jerusalem, thousands of displaced Palestinians walked for days under the sun, their homes gone, their future uncertain. It was a victory for one nation and a wound for generations to come. And in the midst of chaos, new players emerged, ones who didn't wear uniforms. Among them was a mysterious figure known only by his codename, Orion. A former intelligence officer, fluent in Arabic, Russian, and Hebrew, he moved between borders like a ghost. Some said he worked for the CIA. Others claimed he was Mossad's most valuable double agent inside Egyptian command. But in truth, no one ever knew. What's clear is that his information shaped key diplomatic moves over the next decade. He predicted the Arab states' rearmament plans, the Soviet presence in Egypt, and even hinted at a coming Egyptian leader who would change everything, a man named Anwar Sadat. By 1968, the world had changed. The map of the Middle East looked different, but the peace was fragile, built not on trust, but on exhaustion. In Egypt, Nasser's speeches grew darker. He promised revenge, swore to retake Sinai, and accused the West of plotting against the Arab world. Behind him, Soviet advisors whispered strategy. In Israel, generals warned that the next war would come not if but when. Meanwhile, in Damascus, Syrian officers met secretly with Soviet envoys. A new alliance was forming, one built not just on weapons, but ideology. The Soviets began training Syrian pilots and radar technicians in Crimea. Every lesson came with a price: total loyalty to Moscow. On the other side, Washington played a double game. Officially, it called for peace talks under the UN Resolution 242. Unofficially, the CIA used the war's aftermath to install listening posts in Turkey and Iran aimed directly at Soviet bases. For every handshake seen on television, a secret cable was being sent to someone in the shadows. And while politicians argued over territory and treaties, the intelligence world kept its own score. Documents declassified years later would reveal that between 1967 and 1969, over 120 covert operations were launched in the Middle East by competing agencies. Spy satellites photographed airbases, agents smuggled microfilm, and embassies became nests of espionage. The war had ended, but the game had only begun. Even within Israel's own ranks, power struggles erupted. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, hailed as a hero, clashed with Prime Minister Levi Eshkol over the future of the occupied territories. Should Israel hold the land for security or trade it for peace? The argument split the cabinet and shaped decades of conflict ahead. In Pakistan and India, analysts watched closely. The rapid success of Israel's air operations became a case study for military planners around the world. In Rawalpindi, senior ISI officers ordered new research into electronic warfare and radar deception. In New Delhi, Indian generals commissioned their own reports on rapid maneuver warfare. Even far from the battlefield, the echoes of 1967 changed doctrines, defenses, and dreams of dominance. By late 1968, the Soviet KGB had completed its internal purge. They never found the mole they were searching for, but that didn't matter. The message had been sent: betrayal would not be tolerated. And quietly, they began preparing for something larger, a network of influence across the Middle East. The name of the new initiative: Operation Scimitar. From Cairo to Damascus, from Tel Aviv to Tehran, the pieces were being set again. The next move would be deadly. And everyone knew, deep down, that the Six-Day War was just the prologue. Because wars end on paper but not in the minds of men. The guns had stopped. But the shadows were only growing longer. By the dawn of 1969, the calm in the Middle East was an illusion, a silence loaded with gunpowder. The Six-Day War had ended, but the wounds it left behind had only begun to bleed. In Cairo, the streets echoed with speeches of vengeance. In Tel Aviv, soldiers stood on borders that had never existed 2 years before. And somewhere between them, the superpowers of the world prepared to fight a new kind of war, a war fought not with tanks, but with spies, money, and misinformation. The Soviet Union returned to Egypt like a wounded predator. Nasser, still haunted by the defeat of 1967, had placed his trust entirely in Moscow. The Kremlin responded with steel. Hundreds of Soviet pilots, radar specialists, and missile engineers arrived disguised as military advisors. They rebuilt Egypt's air defense from scratch, one radar, one missile site at a time. But these men weren't just soldiers. They were the vanguard of Operation Scimitar, a massive KGB mission to turn the Middle East into a Soviet stronghold. Inside a secret building on Khalifa Street, Cairo, a Soviet operative named Colonel Viktor Sokolov coordinated the flow of intelligence. Every intercepted message, every photo from Sinai, every whispered report from Israeli radio chatter landed on his desk. He knew things no one else did: the location of Israel's new bases, the American ships docked in Haifa, and even the secret identity of a Mossad officer operating in Beirut under the alias David Harari. Sokolov wasn't just collecting data, he was reshaping the battlefield. But he wasn't alone. The CIA had its own eyes in Cairo, a network run by a mysterious informant codenamed Lotus. No one ever learned Lotus's real name, but historians now believe she was an Egyptian journalist who had once studied in Washington. Her reports were gold. She leaked details about Soviet troop movements, radar positions, and high-level meetings between Nasser and his generals. Thanks to her, the CIA could map Soviet influence like a chessboard: each move, each countermove, each secret handshake. By 1970, the region became a living spy novel. In one night alone, Mossad agents sabotaged a Soviet radar base near Port Said, blowing up its communication tower. 2 days later, an Egyptian commando unit, trained by the KGB, ambushed an Israeli patrol across the Suez Canal. The world never heard about these skirmishes. Officially, the war was over. Unofficially, it was only transforming. In Tel Aviv, Mossad's headquarters buzzed with a new mission: neutralize Soviet assets across the Middle East. Directors v. Zamir approved dozens of covert operations targeting spies, diplomats, and suspected collaborators. Among them was Operation Mirror, a mission to plant false documents suggesting that a high-ranking Egyptian general was leaking secrets to Israel. When the forged papers reached Cairo, panic erupted. Nasser ordered a purge of his top officers. Dozens were arrested, some executed. Mossad hadn't fired a single bullet, but it had destroyed Egypt's inner circle from within. At the same time, a quieter figure worked in the shadows: Anwar Sadat. Ambitious, patient, and quietly resentful of Soviet interference, he began plotting his own path. While Nasser leaned toward Moscow, Sadat opened secret channels to the Americans. He believed that Egypt's future didn't lie under the red flag of communism but in diplomacy. The seeds of what would later become the Camp David Accords were planted here, in secret meetings disguised as cultural exchanges. But in 1970, the world shifted again. On September 28, President Nasser suffered a sudden heart attack and died. Crowds filled Cairo's streets. The man who had embodied Arab unity was gone, and in his place rose Anwar Sadat, the quiet vice president no one had taken seriously. The Soviets celebrated, believing Sadat was their man. They were wrong. Sadat played the perfect game. In public, he thanked Moscow for its support. In private, he began removing Soviet officers, one by one, replacing them with loyal Egyptians. He watched, waited, and planned. Meanwhile, in the north, Syria was transforming too. Under Hafez al-Assad, Damascus became the Soviet Union's most reliable partner. The KGB established new listening stations in Latakia, and Soviet warships began patrolling the Mediterranean under the pretext of training. But the truth was simpler: Moscow was watching everything. The CIA saw this shift coming. From its base in Tehran, agents monitored Soviet convoys through satellite imagery provided by the KH-9 Hexagon, one of the first American spy satellites. Every launch and landing was timed with precision. One intercepted Soviet cable even revealed the testing of a new surface-to-air missile system, later known as the SA-6 Gainful, which would prove devastating in the next conflict. And through it all, the human stories continued, invisible, unrecorded, but powerful. In Jerusalem, families resettled in homes that once belonged to others. In Sinai, Bedouins found their desert split by fences and checkpoints. In Cairo, widows of soldiers still wore black, their grief turning into bitterness. Peace was a word no one trusted anymore. Then, in the middle of 1971, the Soviets made their boldest move yet. They proposed a joint Egyptian-Soviet command structure, effectively taking control of Egypt's military. It was the final step in Operation Scimitar. For Moscow, it meant total dominance over the Arab world. For Sadat, it was the line he refused to cross. Late one night, Sadat met privately with his generals. No advisors. No translators. He spoke softly but with steel in his voice. "We will not trade one occupation for another." The next morning, he announced the expulsion of over 15,000 Soviet advisors. The Kremlin was stunned. The KGB scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. They called it the Cairo betrayal. But Sadat had already moved on. He began secretly rebuilding Egypt's army not with Soviet help, but with new weapons quietly sourced from France and later the United States. In Moscow, the humiliation burned deep. Colonel Sokolov, the architect of Operation Scimitar, was recalled, interrogated, and erased from official records. The KGB called him a failure. History would call him a ghost. By 1972, the chessboard was set once again. Egypt, under Sadat, had shifted its loyalties. Israel stood confident but increasingly isolated. The Americans saw opportunity. And in the Kremlin, silence filled the halls once busy with plans of conquest. But silence is deceptive. Because beneath it revenge was brewing. In a remote Soviet base near Kaluga, military planners began drafting new scenarios under a chilling title. Operation Badr, the Arab counterstroke. No one outside those walls knew it then. But the seeds of the next great war, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, had already been planted. And when those seeds finally bloomed, the desert would once again burn not with ideology, but with vengeance. The desert was silent, unnaturally silent. It was October 6, 1973. The sun rose over the Sinai sands, painting the horizon in a burning orange hue. To the north, along the Golan Heights, Syrian tanks rumbled forward. And in the south, along the Suez Canal, Egyptian soldiers whispered prayers before stepping into boats. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a day when Israel rested, and its army stood at half readiness. No one expected war. No one except Anwar Sadat. For years, Sadat had waited, watched, rebuilt, and trained in silence. Now, his army was ready. Operation Badr, named after the Prophet Muhammad's first great victory, had begun. At 2:00 p.m., over 200 Egyptian jets roared across the sky, striking Israeli positions along the canal. Simultaneously, 8,000 commandos stormed across in rubber boats. Within hours, Egypt had breached the impregnable Bar-Lev line, a wall Israel believed no force could ever cross. In Tel Aviv, panic spread. The Israeli leadership, stunned by the sudden assault, scrambled to respond. Prime Minister Golda Meir rushed to convene her war cabinet. Across the room, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the hero of 1967, stared in disbelief at the maps. He whispered, "This is the end of the Third Temple." It was the first time Israel had ever been caught completely off guard. But this was no ordinary war. This was a war born from humiliation, from the ashes of 1967. For Sadat, this was not about destroying Israel. It was about restoring dignity, proving that the Arab world could still fight, could still bleed, could still stand. He had one goal: cross the canal, hold ground, and force the world to negotiate. For the first 3 days, Egypt and Syria achieved the impossible. In the north, 1,400 Syrian tanks pushed deep into Israeli territory, threatening the Golan. In the south, Egyptian forces advanced 15 kilometers into Sinai, using Soviet-made SAM missile shields to block Israeli air power. The myth of Israeli invincibility shattered. Then came the counterstrike. By October 10, Israel had mobilized its reserves. Columns of Merkava and Centurion tanks thundered toward the front. The Israeli Air Force, led by aces trained during the Six-Day War, launched relentless air raids. The tide began to turn. In the north, Israeli brigades under Ariel Sharon and Avigdor Ben-Gal counterattacked with surgical precision, halting the Syrian advance. Within days, Israeli forces were pushing toward Damascus itself. But Sadat had achieved what he wanted: attention. For the first time, the United States and Soviet Union were dragged to the edge of direct confrontation. The Middle East had become the most dangerous square on the Cold War chessboard. In Washington, Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, received urgent reports. Soviet cargo planes were airlifting weapons to Syria and Egypt, over 900 tons of munitions per day. In response, President Richard Nixon ordered Operation Nickel Grass, an American airlift supplying Israel with tanks, ammunition, and jet parts. The skies above the Mediterranean became a silent war zone of logistics. Every plane, every flight was a message: our allies will not fall. Moscow took the signal and replied in kind. Soviet naval fleets entered the Mediterranean, shadowing U.S. aircraft carriers. Submarines moved into position. In a top-secret memo, KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov warned the Politburo. If the Americans land forces in Sinai, we must respond immediately. For a brief, terrifying week, the world stood one step away from World War III. But even as the superpowers postured, on the ground, soldiers fought and died for mere meters of land. In the Sinai, Israeli units under General Ariel Sharon executed a daring maneuver. Crossing the Suez Canal under heavy fire, they surrounded the Egyptian Third Army, cutting off supply lines and trapping over 20,000 soldiers. Sadat now faced a dilemma: push forward and risk total destruction, or negotiate and save what had been gained. He chose diplomacy. By October 25, 1973, a UN-brokered ceasefire came into effect. The guns finally fell silent. When the dust settled, both sides claimed victory, but neither truly won. Egypt had regained honor but lost thousands. Israel had survived, but its image of invincibility was gone. And the superpowers, both shaken, realized just how close they had come to the unthinkable. In the years that followed, history began to shift again. The war had humbled nations and hardened leaders, but it also opened doors that had never existed before. In 1977, against all odds, Anwar Sadat made a move that stunned the world. He flew to Jerusalem, stood before the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and declared, "I have come to you so that together we might build a durable peace." The world watched in disbelief. An Egyptian president, once the enemy, was now shaking hands with the nation he had fought. The journey that began with Operation Badr now led to Camp David, where Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, under the guidance of U.S. President Jimmy Carter, signed the Camp David Accords in 1978. It was the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. But peace came at a cost. Sadat paid for it with his life. On October 6, 1981, the anniversary of the very war that restored his nation's pride, Anwar Sadat was assassinated during a military parade in Cairo by extremists who called him a traitor. His blood stained the same soil that had once echoed with the sounds of victory. Yet even in death, Sadat changed history. His courage redefined what leadership meant, not just in Egypt, but in a region trapped between pride and pain. As the years rolled on, the echoes of 1967 and 1973 continued to shape every border, every negotiation, every silence that followed. Each generation inherited the same question: did we win the war, or did the war win us? Today, the battlefields of Sinai and Golan lie quiet. The bunkers are buried, the tanks rust under the desert sun. But beneath the dust, the stories remain of courage, sacrifice, and the haunting cost of ambition. Because history is never just about who fired the first shot. It's about who learns from the last one. And in the end, as one soldier once whispered under the burning skies of Sinai, "We fought to prove our strength. But all we proved was how fragile peace can be." The screen fades to black. The sound of a slow, distant heartbeat echoes steady, haunting. Then, in silence, a line appears.